Some war films didn't just vanish into obscurity. They were buried, banned, or forgotten. Sometimes by governments, sometimes by studios, and sometimes just by history itself. But what happens when these films crawl back from the ashes, decades later, and suddenly everyone realizes what was almost lost forever? Have you ever wondered which war films were once impossible to find, but now stand as masterpieces? Let's dig into the stories of 15 lost war films that resurfaced in the most unexpected ways. All Quiet on the Western Front, 1930. This wasn't just a war movie. This was the film the Nazis feared so much they literally unleashed mobs to shut it down. Louis Milestone's All Quiet on the Western Front, adapted from Erich Maria Remarque's novel, is still considered one of the most powerful anti-war statements ever put on film. But when it premiered in Germany, Joseph Goebbels himself organized disruptions, releasing rats into theaters, blowing whistles, and stirring chaos. Why? Because the movie dared to show German soldiers as fragile, human, and broken, instead of heroic warriors. After that, the film was banned outright in Germany and chopped up in multiple countries. For decades, full versions were nearly impossible to find. Even the original negative was thought to be destroyed during World War II. What survived were fragments, censored prints, and shortened versions that robbed it of its raw power. But in the 1970s, archivists tracked down reels across the globe and pieced it back together. When the restored cut resurfaced, critics were floored all over again. It wasn't just a film, it was a time capsule of the interwar period, a cinematic scream against nationalism. Today it's recognized as one of the most essential war films ever made, and yet, for nearly half a century, audiences barely got to see it in its true form. That's how close this anti-war classic came to being lost to history forever. The Battle of Russia, 1943. During World War II, the United States churned out propaganda films like a factory. But The Battle of Russia was different. Directed by Frank Capra as part of his Why We Fight series, it praised the Soviet Union's struggle against Nazi Germany. At the time, America and the USSR were allies, so it made sense. The film showed Russian civilians digging trenches, armies clashing in snowstorms, and the sheer brutality of the Eastern Front. For American audiences, it was a lesson in why the Soviets were vital partners in defeating Hitler. Then came the Cold War. Suddenly, the USSR was no longer a noble ally, but the big red enemy. That meant the Battle of Russia went from patriotic to politically toxic almost overnight. The US government quietly shelved it, refusing to screen it for decades. In fact, it was practically erased from the cultural record, dismissed as pro-Soviet propaganda. The twist? When copies resurfaced in archives years later, historians were stunned at its accuracy. Yes, it glossed over Soviet atrocities, but as a document of wartime propaganda, and as one of the only American films to portray the Eastern Front in detail, it became a priceless artifact. What had once been buried because of politics now stood as a reminder that even governments rewrite history when it suits them. Imagine being told for decades this film didn't exist, only to have it resurface and remind you just how fragile official truth can be. Kameradschaft, 1931. Picture this. A coal mine disaster along the French-German border. Miners trapped underground, suffocating in the dark, and only a desperate rescue mission can save them. The twist? The rescuers come from across enemy lines. That's the story of Kameradschaft, a German film directed by G. B.U. Pabst. Released just 13 years after World War I, it was a radical plea for peace and unity, an anti-war film disguised as a disaster movie. But here's the problem. When the Nazis rose to power, a film that promoted Franco-German friendship was the last thing they wanted. The film was censored, banned, and practically erased from circulation in Germany. For decades, it was almost impossible to see outside of a few battered prints in archives. When it resurfaced in restored form late in the 20th century, audiences finally understood its daring message. The underground mine became a metaphor for the trenches of World War I, where men fought and died for flags while buried in mud. Critics hailed it as one of Pabst's greatest works, a humanist masterpiece that was silenced by fascism. Watching it today feels eerie, like hearing a ghost from the past whispering that peace was always possible, if only people had listened. For years, Kameradschaft was treated as a lost relic. Now, it's rightly recognized as one of the boldest anti-war films of its generation. The Burmese Harp, 1956. Not every war film is about bombs and bullets. Some are about the silence that follows. Kon Ichikawa's The Burmese Harp is a Japanese masterpiece that stunned audiences when it debuted in 1956. It tells the story of a soldier who, after the surrender, wanders through Burma and becomes a Buddhist monk, dedicating himself to burying the countless war dead left to rot on the battlefield. It's meditative, haunting, and unlike anything coming out of Japan at the time. But outside of Japan, the film barely circulated. Western distributors thought it was too foreign, too slow, too quiet compared to the action-driven war movies dominating screens. For decades, it slipped into obscurity, especially as post-war Japan tried to rebuild its cinematic reputation. It wasn't until retrospectives and restorations in the late 20th century that the Burmese Harp resurfaced internationally. When it did, critics were floored. Here was a war film that rejected violence entirely, instead meditating on grief, memory, and the futility of conflict. It became clear that Ichikawa had made one of the greatest anti-war films ever created, but the world nearly forgot it existed. Watching it today feels like uncovering a buried poem written in the ruins of war. The Red and the White, 1967. If you thought Soviet war films were all patriotic flag-waving, think again. Miklos Jankso's The Red and the White shocked audiences with its bleak, unromantic look at the Russian Civil War. Instead of heroes and villains, Jankso showed chaos, endless executions, senseless violence, men crushed by forces beyond their control. No uplifting speeches, no noble sacrifice, just brutality. The Hungarian authorities hated it. The Soviets weren't thrilled either. Both saw it as undermining socialist heroism. As a result, the film was banned in Hungary, heavily censored in the USSR, and practically unavailable for decades. It lingered in obscurity, known only to a handful of cinephiles who caught glimpses at film festivals before it vanished again. When the uncut version finally resurfaced years later, critics hailed it as a revelation. Its sweeping camera movements and detached perspective made it one of the most unique war films ever shot. More like a haunting ballet of death than a conventional drama. Watching it today, you can see why it scared authorities. It didn't glorify anyone. It just exposed war as meaningless slaughter. What governments tried to bury turned out to be one of cinema's greatest anti-war statements, a film that feels more daring now than it did in the 1960s. The Battle of Algiers, 1966. Few films in history have been as dangerous as the Battle of Algiers. Directed by Gillo Pontecorvo, it reenacted the Algerian struggle against French colonial rule with such realism that many people thought it was an actual documentary. It was shot on the streets with non-professional actors, staged riots, and chilling depictions of bombings and torture. For Algeria, it was a bold portrait of resistance. For France, it was a political grenade. The French government banned the film for years, refusing to allow screenings that might stir sympathy for the independence movement. Even in other countries, theaters were hesitant, fearing riots or diplomatic pressure. It all but disappeared in the West, its reputation spreading more through whispers than actual screenings. For decades, the only way to see it was at rare underground showings or film festivals where prints slipped through the cracks. When it resurfaced in restored editions in the late 20th century, its power was undeniable. The Pentagon even used it in training sessions, showing officers how urban insurgencies work. Imagine that, a banned film about colonial oppression being used as a manual for modern warfare. Critics today still hail it as one of the greatest war films ever made, raw, uncompromising, and disturbingly timeless. Once suppressed for being too truthful, it came back with even more force. The Ascent, 1977. This is not your typical Soviet war movie. Larisa Shepitko's The Ascent is about two Soviet partisans captured by Nazis during World War II. But instead of focusing on battles or explosions, It dives into moral collapse, betrayal, and the spiritual cost of survival. Its stark, frozen landscapes and raw performances make it feel more like a parable than a traditional war drama. The problem? Soviet authorities didn't like parables. They wanted heroic tales of glorious sacrifice. Shepitko's bleak, uncompromising vision, where one man betrays another to save himself, was too grim for official approval. Though the film briefly screened and even won the Golden Bear at the Berlin International Film Festival, back home it was pulled, buried, and nearly lost to censorship. For years, the Ascent existed only in limited copies, largely unseen outside small circles. But when it was restored decades later, critics were stunned. It wasn't just a war movie. It was a searing meditation on morality under impossible circumstances. Watching it now feels like staring into the frozen heart of war itself. What the Soviet state tried to erase has become one of the most acclaimed Russian films ever made. It proves that sometimes the most dangerous thing a war film can do isn't showing violence, it's showing doubt. Fires were started. 1943. Not every war film was about soldiers on the front. Some were about the battle at home. Fires Were Started, directed by Humphrey Jennings, dramatized the work of Britain's auxiliary fire service during the Blitz. It wasn't flashy propaganda, it was stark, authentic, and filmed with real firefighters instead of actors. The result feels more like documentary than fiction, capturing the nightly terror of bombs raining down on London. For years, the film was overshadowed by bigger wartime dramas and slipped into semi-obscurity. Outside of Britain, it was rarely seen, and even within the UK, only battered 16mm copies circulated. But rediscovery came when archivists restored Jennings' work, and suddenly audiences realized what had almost been lost. One of the most powerful depictions of civilian endurance ever shot. Today, Fires Were Started is widely available, with restored clips online through the BFI and even on YouTube. Watching it now, with its eerie realism and exhausted, soot-streaked faces, feels like staring straight into the heart of wartime London. It proves that sometimes the quietest war films, the ones about ordinary people, are the hardest to forget. The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, 1921. Before Hollywood became the war movie machine, we know, The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse set the stage. Rex Ingram's silent epic from 1921, starring a then-unknown Rudolph Valentino, shocked audiences with its scale. It showed World War I not as a distant campaign, but as an apocalypse tearing families apart, framed by the allegory of the Four Horsemen riding across Europe. For decades, the original film was considered lost in its complete form. The surviving prints were heavily cut, degraded, and circulated only in fragments. By mid-century, even Valentino fans believed it might be gone for good. But in the 1960s, archivists pieced together a more complete version, restoring its grandeur. What resurfaced wasn't just a lost war drama. It was a reminder of how early cinema could still feel epic, political, and personal. Clips from The Four Horsemen are easy to find today, with restored scenes circulating on YouTube and film retrospectives. Its rediscovery cemented it as one of the greatest silent anti-war films ever made, showing that the lost classic can sometimes be older and bolder than anyone expects. La Grande Illusion, 1937. Jean Renoir's La Grande Illusion wasn't just another war movie, it was one of Hitler's most hated films. The Nazis banned it outright, labeling it cinematic enemy number one. Why? Because it showed French and German soldiers finding common humanity in the trenches of World War I, undermining the idea of endless national hatred. It was the kind of message dictators couldn't tolerate. During World War II, the original negative vanished, presumed destroyed. For years, audiences had to make do with poor quality prints and heavily cut versions. Many thought the full film was lost forever. But in the 1950s, archivists discovered that the Nazis had actually seized the negative and shipped it to Berlin. From there, it survived the bombings, was captured by the Soviets, and eventually resurfaced in the French archives. When restored, La Grande Illusion was recognized all over again as a masterpiece. It's not just a war film, it's a meditation on class, nationalism, and the absurdity of conflict. Orson Welles once called it one of the two movies he would save if the world ended. The fact that it disappeared for decades only adds to its legend. It's proof that even when regimes try to erase art, sometimes history itself conspires to bring it back. Go Tell the Spartans, 1978. When it came out in 1978, Go Tell the Spartans hit theaters at the wrong time. America was still reeling from Vietnam, and nobody wanted to sit through another reminder of that nightmare. The film, starring Burt Lancaster, focused not on glory, but on the futility of U.S. involvement in Vietnam, set in 1964, before the war even escalated. It showed soldiers thrown into a hopeless situation, abandoned by leadership, and left to die in a war no one really understood. Critics praised it for honesty, but audiences avoided it like the plague. It barely made money, got buried by distributors, and faded fast from public memory. For years, it existed mostly in whispers, overshadowed by later, bigger Vietnam films like Platoon or Apocalypse Now. But here's the twist. Those later classics made audiences realize just how ahead of its time Go Tell the Spartans was. When it resurfaced on home video and in retrospective screenings in the 80s and 90s, critics reappraised it as one of the most brutally accurate depictions of Vietnam ever filmed. Lancaster's weary performance gained cult respect, and the movie became a sort of secret handshake among war film buffs. Once dismissed as too raw and too early, Go Tell the Spartans came back to claim its place as one of the first true Vietnam War exposés. Men Must Fight, 1933. Imagine watching a film in 1933 that openly predicted another world war, 6 years before World War II even began. That's what audiences got with Men Must Fight, a prophetic MGM drama about a future global conflict. It featured air raids, bombings, and warnings about blind nationalism. At the time, it felt like a strange, speculative fantasy. But by the late 1930s, it looked terrifyingly accurate. The film quickly became awkward. Studios and politicians weren't eager to keep screening a movie that basically told people the next big war is coming. As the real war loomed, it slipped quietly out of circulation. By the 1950s, it was virtually forgotten, written off as just another early talkie that didn't matter. Then historians dug it up decades later, and jaws dropped. Here was a film that predicted aerial warfare almost exactly as it happened. It showed the destruction of cities before the Blitz, before Hiroshima, before the Cold War. Watching it now feels eerie, like a cinematic prophecy. Men Must Fight wasn't lost by accident. It was ignored because it was too right, too soon. Rediscovered in later decades, it became a chilling reminder that sometimes art sees the future more clearly than politicians. The Eagle and the Hawk, 1933. Long before war films became a Hollywood staple, The Eagle and the Hawk offered one of the bleakest takes on World War I. Starring Frederick March and Cary Grant, it told the story of fighter pilots who start out as heroes, but are crushed by the endless grind of battle. Instead of noble sacrifice, the film showed despair, trauma, and disillusionment. It was one of the first American movies to openly suggest that war chews men up and spits them out. But in 1933, that message was too dark. Paramount executives hacked away at the ending, deleting key moments to make it less depressing. Over the years, original prints were lost, leaving only the censored version circulating. For decades, audiences had no idea how harsh and unflinching the film truly was. When a restored cut was finally pieced together from surviving reels, critics realized just how daring it had been for its time. Cary Grant's cold-blooded supporting role shocked modern viewers used to his later suave image, and Frederick March's haunted performance felt decades ahead of its era. The rediscovery proved that pre-code Hollywood was far bolder about war's horrors than most people assumed. What looked like an old relic turned out to be a landmark anti-war film hiding in plain sight. The Cranes Are Flying, 1957. In 1957, Soviet cinema stunned the world with The Cranes Are Flying. Directed by Mikhail Kalatozov, it told the story of a young woman and her lover torn apart by World War II. Unlike the patriotic Soviet films of the era, this one focused on ordinary people, grief, and shattered lives. Its fluid camera work, sweeping crane shots, and emotional intensity made it a revelation. The film won the Palme d'Or at Cannes, shocking Western audiences who had written off Soviet films as rigid propaganda. But back home, it was quietly downplayed. Soviet authorities didn't ban it outright, but they didn't exactly celebrate its focus on loss rather than victory. Over time, prints faded, distribution dried up, and outside of film festivals it became nearly impossible to see. When it resurfaced in restored form decades later, critics hailed it as a masterpiece of world cinema. The imagery, bombed-out cities, desperate embraces, cranes flying overhead as symbols of resilience, remains unforgettable. It wasn't the story the Soviet state wanted to highlight, which is why it drifted into obscurity. But once rediscovered, it became proof that even in censored systems, artists could create works of staggering humanity. Today, it's rightly regarded as one of the greatest war films ever made. The Bridge, 1959. West Germany's. The Bridge isn't just a war film, it's one of the harshest indictments of war ever created. Directed by Bernhard Wicki, it tells the story of 7 teenage boys drafted in the final days of World War II. Their mission: defend a useless bridge against advancing American tanks. They fight, they die, and the bridge doesn't matter. It's an unflinching look at wasted youth and pointless sacrifice. When it debuted in 1959, it shocked audiences. But over time, it was overshadowed by bigger, flashier international war films. Distribution faltered, and outside of Germany, it was hard to find. For years, it lingered in obscurity, known mainly through secondhand praise. Then, restorations and retrospectives brought it back. Modern audiences were stunned at how modern it felt: raw, intimate, and merciless. Unlike the patriotic war epics of the 50s, The Bridge felt closer to the anti-war cynicism of the 70s. It proved that German filmmakers were already grappling with the meaninglessness of war long before Hollywood caught up. Rediscovered just in time, it reclaimed its spot as a classic, reminding us that the most devastating war films are often the ones about ordinary kids caught in extraordinary tragedy. So, there you have it. 15 war films that were buried, banned, or forgotten, only to resurface and remind us just how fragile history really is. Some were censored by governments terrified of their truth. Others simply neglected until archivists pieced them back together. But every single one proves the same point. War films aren't just entertainment, they're battlegrounds for memory itself. Which of these rediscoveries do you think deserves the most attention today? Drop your thoughts below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because history always has more secrets waiting to be dug up.